Imagine standing in a room so hot that the windows have been nailed shut. It's July, Philadelphia, 1776. The air smells like candle wax, horse manure from the street below, and the nervous sweat of 56 men who are about to do something that could get every single one of them hanged. And you're one of them. Not a king, not a general, a printer, a farmer, a lawyer, a doctor. Ordinary men making an extraordinary decision. Not knowing if it would work, not knowing if they'd survive it, not knowing if anyone would even remember their names 200 years later. This is the story of what actually happened in that room. The arguments, the compromises, the near failures, the moments where the whole thing almost fell apart. Because the version you learned in school, it left out a lot of the good stuff, so let's go back. All the way back to the summer that changed everything. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing something a little different. Instead of just walking through history facts, we're going to experience it. We're going to put ourselves inside Independence Hall in Philadelphia and watch the Declaration of Independence get argued over, revised, nearly destroyed, and finally, after weeks of exhausting debate, signed. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to look at that document completely differently. Let's get into it. Before we can understand what happened in the summer of 1776, we need to understand where these men were coming from. Because they didn't just walk in one day and decide to start a new country. This had been building for years. Think about it from their perspective. These were British subjects. Most of them were proud to be British subjects. They had British educations, British customs, British tastes in food and fashion and literature. Many of them had families still living in England. Benjamin Franklin had spent years in London as a colonial agent, trying to work things out diplomatically. He genuinely loved Britain. So what changed? A lot. And most of it came down to one word: taxation. Now, when you hear no taxation without representation, it probably sounds like a slogan on a bumper sticker. But in the 1760s and early 1770s, it was a genuinely radical idea. The idea that a government had no right to tax people who had no voice in that government. The British Parliament kept passing tax after tax after tax on the colonies. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, taxes on paper, on glass, on paint, on tea. And every time the colonists pushed back, Parliament doubled down. They sent more soldiers. They quartered troops in private homes. They shut down colonial assemblies. And then came 1770, the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists shot dead by British soldiers on a street corner. The word massacre is a bit dramatic for what actually happened. It was chaotic. It was arguably provoked. But the image of British soldiers firing on unarmed civilians. That image traveled through the colonies like wildfire. Then, 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Colonists dumping 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor. Parliament responds by passing the Coercive Acts, what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, essentially putting Massachusetts under military rule. By 1775, shots have been fired at Lexington and Concord. Men are dying, and the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia, trying to figure out what to do next. Here's the thing, though. Even at this point, in mid-1775, most delegates are not calling for independence. They still want to work things out with Britain. They're sending the olive branch petition to King George, essentially saying, "Please, can we talk about this?" King George refuses to even read it, and that's when the mood starts to shift. January 1776. A 47-page pamphlet appears in Philadelphia. It's called Common Sense, and it's written by a man named Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant from England who had been in America for barely a year. He had no formal political training. He was, up until recently, a corset maker. And yet, Common Sense becomes the most widely read piece of political writing in American history. Why? Because Paine did something nobody had done before. He didn't write for scholars and aristocrats. He wrote for ordinary people. He used plain language. He made arguments that any farmer or tradesman could follow. And his central argument was brutally simple. Monarchy is stupid. Not just British monarchy. All monarchy. The idea that one person, born into a royal family, should rule over millions of other people. It's absurd. It's irrational. It goes against basic common sense. Paine wrote that the colonies had an opportunity to do something the world had never seen, to prove that people could govern themselves, that you didn't need a king to have order and prosperity and justice. Within 3 months, 100,000 copies had been sold in a country of about 2.5 million people. Adjust for population, and that's like selling the equivalent of 13 million copies today. Everyone was reading it. George Washington had it read aloud to his troops. John Adams called it a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass, which tells you how threatened certain people felt by it. Because here's the thing. Common sense didn't just argue for independence. It argued for a new kind of government, a republic. And that idea was intoxicating to a lot of people. By the spring of 1776, the question of independence wasn't going away anymore. It was the only thing anyone was talking about. The Pennsylvania State House, what we now call Independence Hall, is a red brick building on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. In 1776, Philadelphia is the largest city in the colonies, home to about 40,000 people. It's a bustling, cosmopolitan place. There are coffee houses and taverns on every corner, a thriving printing industry, merchants and lawyers and intellectuals rubbing shoulders on the cobblestone streets. The delegates to the Second Continental Congress come from all 13 colonies. They are not a homogeneous group. They have very different personalities, very different interests, and very different opinions about what should be done. You've got John Adams from Massachusetts. Brilliant, stubborn, intensely principled, occasionally infuriating. Adams is one of the most passionate advocates for independence. He has been pushing for it for months. His letters from this period are full of barely contained frustration at how slowly things are moving. You've got Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old, the most famous American in the world, recently returned from London, where he spent years trying to prevent this conflict. Franklin is quieter now than he once was. He's seen too much. But when he speaks, everyone listens. You've got Roger Sherman from Connecticut, a shoemaker-turned-politician who is one of the most underrated figures of the founding era. Not flashy, not eloquent, but enormously practical and trusted by almost everyone. You've got Robert Livingston from New York, wealthy, conservative, deeply nervous about what independence might mean for the social order. And then there's the delegation from Virginia. Virginia is the largest and most powerful colony. What Virginia thinks matters enormously. And Virginia sends, among others, a tall, quiet, 33-year-old lawyer and plantation owner named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had already established himself as a gifted writer. His 1774 pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America, had made people take notice. He wasn't a great orator. He was actually quite shy in public settings, rarely spoke in debate. But on paper, Thomas Jefferson was extraordinary. He would need to be. June 7th, 1776. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stands up in Congress and delivers what becomes known as the Lee Resolution. It's a short statement, just a few lines, but its meaning is enormous. Lee proposes that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. This is the moment. The formal motion for independence is on the table. The debate that follows is fierce. Some delegates are completely on board. Others are terrified. And a significant number say they need to go home and consult their colonial assemblies before they can vote on something this consequential. Congress decides to postpone the formal vote for 3 weeks. But here's the thing. They don't want to waste those 3 weeks. So they appoint a committee of 5 to draft a document that would explain and justify independence, just in case the vote goes in favor of it. The committee of 5 consists of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson, and they need someone to write the actual draft. Adams, in his memoirs, describes the conversation where Jefferson was asked to take the lead. Jefferson apparently tried to defer to Adams. Adams refused. Jefferson asked why. And Adams gave him several reasons. Jefferson was from Virginia, which gave the document more geographic legitimacy. Jefferson had a better pen, and Adams admitted, somewhat ruefully, that he was too obnoxious and disliked to be the one to write it. Whether that conversation happened exactly as Adams described it, we can't say for certain. But Jefferson got the job. Jefferson rents rooms on the 2nd floor of a house on Market Street, owned by a bricklayer named Jacob Graff. The house is on the outskirts of the city, a bit quieter than the center. Jefferson sets up his portable writing desk, a clever folding contraption he had designed himself, and gets to work. He writes alone. He doesn't look things up in books, he later claimed, because he wasn't trying to say anything new. He was trying to express what everyone already believed. The goal, as he put it, was to be an expression of the American mind. He draws on decades of Enlightenment philosophy. John Locke's ideas about natural rights, life, liberty, and property. The French philosophes. His own earlier writing, he synthesizes all of it into something that feels both philosophically rigorous and completely accessible. The first 2 paragraphs that Jefferson writes, which become the most famous 2 paragraphs in American political history, take the reader through a complete argument in about 200 words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Think about what Jefferson is doing here. He's not saying these rights come from a king, or a parliament, or a constitution. He's saying they come from nature itself, from creation, from God, if you like. And because they come from nature, no government can take them away. Any government that tries is illegitimate, and when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. That is a revolutionary statement, not just politically but philosophically. Jefferson is making the case that revolution isn't just permissible, it's sometimes required. Then he moves into what he calls a long train of abuses, a list of grievances against King George. This part is less poetic and more prosecutorial. It's a lawyer's brief. Jefferson is making a case to the world that Britain has forfeited its right to govern the colonies. He finishes a draft in about 2 weeks. He shows it to Adams and Franklin before presenting it to the full Congress. Adams makes a few small changes. Franklin makes a few more. One of Franklin's additions is modest but consequential, where Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Franklin changed it to self-evident. That single word change shifts the argument from religious authority to rational logic. June 28, 1776. Jefferson's draft is presented to Congress, and then Congress does what Congress does. They tear it apart. Over the next several days, the delegates debate, revise, cut, and rewrite the document. Jefferson sits and watches, mostly in agonized silence. Adams later wrote that he acted as Jefferson's advocate in the debates, defending the original language against what Jefferson saw as mutilation. In total, Congress makes 86 changes to Jefferson's draft. They cut about a quarter of the entire document. Most of the cuts are improvements, honestly. Some of Jefferson's original passages are a bit verbose. Some of the grievances against the king read as petty or overstated. Congress sharpens the document considerably. But there is one cut that Jefferson never forgave them for. In Jefferson's original draft, there is a passage blaming King George for the slave trade. Jefferson, who, yes, owned enslaved people himself, which we'll come back to, wrote that the king had waged cruel war against human nature itself by introducing slavery into the colonies and perpetuating it. He called it a cruel war against human nature. It's one of the most remarkable passages in the document, and Congress cuts it entirely. Why? Because delegates from South Carolina and Georgia refuse to support independence if that passage stays in. They're not going to sign a document that condemns the institution their entire economy depends on. And some northern delegates, whose merchants have profited from the slave trade, aren't eager to condemn it either. So it goes. The contradiction at the heart of the American founding, all men are created equal, except for the roughly 500,000 enslaved people living in the colonies, is papered over. The most powerful criticism of slavery that Jefferson ever wrote is removed from the historical record. Jefferson is furious. He keeps a copy of the original draft and shows it to people for years afterward, marking the deletions Congress made so they can see what was lost. July 1st, 1776. The formal vote on independence is finally called. And it doesn't go cleanly. 9 colonies vote in favor. Pennsylvania and South Carolina vote against. Delaware is split. It has only 2 delegates present, and they're on opposite sides. New York abstains because its delegates don't yet have authorization from home to vote for independence. This is not the unanimous vote that the history books sometimes imply. This is a messy, contentious, hard-fought political battle. What happens next is one of the great stories of the founding era. Caesar Rodney is a Delaware delegate who is homesick. He has cancer, a serious facial cancer that he's been dealing with for years. He's not supposed to be traveling, but when he gets word that Delaware is split and his vote could make the difference, he rides through the night. 80 miles on horseback, through a thunderstorm, arriving in Philadelphia the morning of July 2nd, just in time to cast Delaware's decisive vote for independence. South Carolina switches its vote. Pennsylvania's delegation shifts when 2 of its most conservative members, John Dickinson and Robert Morris, decide to simply not show up, allowing the pro-independence delegates to carry the state. On July 2nd, 1776, 12 of the 13 colonial delegations vote in favor of independence. New York still abstains, but will formally endorse the decision 9 days later. John Adams, writing to his wife Abigail that night, is almost giddy. He predicts that July 2nd will be celebrated forever as the great anniversary of American independence, with parades and bonfires and illuminations. He gets the celebration right. He just gets the date wrong by 2 days. So if the vote happened on July 2nd, why do we celebrate July 4th? Because July 4th is when Congress finalized and officially adopted the text of the Declaration. After the vote on independence, there are still 2 more days of debate over the exact wording. Delegates argue over specific phrases, specific charges against the king, the tone of certain passages. The 86 changes we talked about happen during this period. On the evening of July 4th, Congress approves the final text. It's engrossed, meaning it's written out in a clean, formal copy on parchment, and the document is dated July 4th, 1776. But here's something most people don't know. Most of the delegates don't actually sign the Declaration on July 4th. There's a persistent image of all 56 delegates crowding around a table and signing the document on July 4th, 1776. It's the image in countless paintings. It's not really what happened. Most delegates sign on August 2nd, 1776, when the official parchment copy is ready. Some sign even later than that. A few never sign at all because they've left Congress for various reasons. One delegate, Matthew Thornton of New Hampshire, doesn't sign until November 1776. The most famous signature, John Hancock's enormous, elaborate signature as President of Congress, is there on August 2nd. The famous story that he made it large so the king could read it without his spectacles is probably apocryphal, but it makes for a great story. Let's talk about the 56 signers for a minute. Because they're often treated as a single, monolithic group of noble founders, when in reality they were a wildly varied collection of human beings with different backgrounds, different motives, and different levels of courage. The youngest signer is Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, 26 years old. The oldest is Benjamin Franklin, 70 years old. The average age is about 45. 24 of them are lawyers, 11 are merchants, several are farmers and planters. There's a doctor, a minister, a printer. 41 of them owned enslaved people at some point in their lives. That number is important to sit with. Some of them are genuinely idealistic. Others are primarily motivated by commercial grievances, the trade restrictions, the taxes, the interference with colonial business. It would be naive to think all 56 signed for purely noble reasons, and some of them pay dearly for it. The war that follows the Declaration is brutal and long, 8 years in total. Several signers lose their homes to British occupation. A few are captured by British forces and held as prisoners. Some see family members killed. Francis Lewis of New York has his estate destroyed and his wife taken prisoner. She dies shortly after her release. John Hart of New Jersey has to flee his home and live in hiding while British forces ransack his farm. He dies in 1779, never seeing the end of the war. The patriotic story that circulates later, that the signers pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and that many of them lost all three, is somewhat exaggerated. Most of them survive. Most of them do reasonably well, but some of them genuinely suffer for what they did that summer. We can't talk about the Declaration of Independence without spending some real time on its central contradiction. Thomas Jefferson writes that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, including liberty. Thomas Jefferson owns 130 enslaved people at Monticello at the time he writes those words. This is not a minor historical footnote. It is one of the most important facts about the American founding, and it deserves more than a quick acknowledgement before moving on. How do we make sense of this? Some historians argue that Jefferson was a product of his time and environment, that the institution of slavery was so deeply embedded in Virginia society that he couldn't see past it. There's some truth to this, but it's too easy. Jefferson was clearly capable of seeing past the accepted norms of his time in other areas. He was a radical thinker when it suited him. Some argue that Jefferson privately knew slavery was wrong, his own writings suggest this, but was unwilling to pay the personal cost of freeing his enslaved people. This seems closer to the truth. Jefferson wrote extensively about his discomfort with slavery. He called it a moral and political depravity. But he also died with his enslaved people still in bondage, most of them sold after his death to pay his massive debts. Some historians, like the late Joseph Ellis, have described Jefferson as a man who was genuinely tortured by this contradiction, but ultimately resolved it in his own favor. The comforts of Monticello, the lifestyle, the financial dependence on enslaved labor. He chose all of that over the principles he articulated so beautifully. And then there's a harder argument made by scholars like Annette Gordon-Reed and Edmund Morgan, that the contradiction isn't really a contradiction at all, that Jefferson's vision of equality and liberty was specifically designed for white property owners, that the Declaration's beautiful language was never meant to include enslaved Africans or Native Americans or women, that the universality of all men are created equal was rhetorical cover for a quite limited political reality. This doesn't mean the Declaration isn't a great document. It clearly is. But it means the greatness is complicated, and the people who have spent American history pushing to extend those promises to everyone, abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights activists, they've had to fight for something that was explicitly withheld from them at the founding. Frederick Douglass, in his famous 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," captures this perfectly. He calls the Declaration a glorious liberty document, while also noting with scorching irony that its promises applied to him and 4 million enslaved people precisely nowhere. That tension is real, it's uncomfortable, and it's part of the story. July 5th and 6th, 1776. The Declaration is printed and distributed. Philadelphia printer John Dunlap works through the night of July 4th to 5th to produce the first printed copies. They're sent by horse and rider to all 13 colonies. They're read aloud in town squares, in churches, in taverns. Washington has it read to his troops. The public reaction is immediate and intense. In New York City, a crowd tears down a large statue of King George III in Bowling Green. The lead from the statue is melted down and cast into musket balls. People understand the symbolism of that. In Philadelphia, the bells of the State House ring all day on July 8th, when the Declaration is first publicly read. Church bells across the city join in. The crowd cheers. But not everyone cheers. About a third of the colonial population are loyalists, people who remain loyal to the British Crown and are horrified by independence. Some of them leave the country. Some of them take up arms against the patriots. The American Revolution is, among other things, a civil war, and the Declaration makes that civil war explicit. And there are plenty of people who are sympathetic to independence but deeply skeptical of what it might mean for the social order. Abigail Adams writes her famous letter to her husband John in March 1776, before the Declaration, asking him to remember the ladies in the new laws. "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands," she writes. John writes back, essentially laughing it off. Women won't get the vote for another 144 years. The Declaration is a radical document that also has very clear limits on its radicalism. That's part of what makes it so endlessly debated, so continually contested, so alive in American political discourse, even now. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, how does Britain respond? About how you'd expect, initially. King George III and his ministers regard the Declaration as treason, pure and simple. They're not interested in engaging with its philosophical arguments. They plan to put down the rebellion militarily, and at the outset of the war, they have good reason to think they can. Britain has the most powerful navy in the world. They have a professional army. They have enormous financial resources. The Continental Army, by contrast, is poorly equipped, poorly trained, underfunded, and fighting on a shoestring. What Britain underestimates is the difficulty of fighting a war across 3,000 miles of ocean against a population that can simply retreat into vast interior territories and refuse to be decisively defeated. They also underestimate George Washington, not as a brilliant battlefield tactician, because he isn't really, but as someone who understands that his main job is to keep his army in existence until Britain loses the will to fight. There is one element of the British response that's worth noting. The Declaration of Independence is read widely in Europe, and its arguments, its Enlightenment philosophy, its assertion of natural rights resonate with reformers and revolutionaries across the continent. It influences the French Revolution. It inspires Latin American independence movements decades later. It becomes, in a sense, a world historical document, not just an American one. Thomas Paine, who helped spark the revolution with common sense, will go to France and get caught up in the French Revolution. The ideas that circulate through this period in Philadelphia spread outward in ways nobody fully anticipated. The Declaration doesn't win the war. It just starts the clock. The Revolutionary War lasts from April 1775 to September 1783, 8.5 years. It's one of the longer wars in American history, and for much of it, the American cause looks genuinely hopeless. The low point comes in late 1776, just months after the Declaration is signed. Washington's army has been pushed out of New York. They've lost battle after battle. Thousands of soldiers have deserted. The Continental Congress has fled Philadelphia. Thomas Paine, writing a pamphlet called The American Crisis, opens with one of the most famous lines in American political writing. "These are the times that try men's souls." Washington crosses the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, a move you've seen in the famous painting, and attacks a Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. It's a small victory in military terms, but its psychological importance is enormous. It shows that the Continental Army can still fight, still win, still surprise the enemy. The real turning point comes in 1777 at Saratoga, New York, where American forces under General Horatio Gates defeat a British army under General Burgoyne. Burgoyne surrenders his entire force, about 6,000 men. It's the largest British military defeat since the war began. More importantly, it brings France into the war. France has been watching the American Revolution with great interest, partly out of genuine sympathy for Republican ideals, but mostly because they hate Britain and see an opportunity to weaken their great rival. After Saratoga proves the Americans can actually win, France officially enters the war as an American ally in 1778. Spain and the Netherlands follow. Suddenly, Britain is fighting a world war, not just putting down a colonial rebellion. Their strategic position deteriorates rapidly. The war ends at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781, when Washington and French General Rochambeau trap Cornwallis's army on a peninsula. French ships block British naval relief. After a 3-week siege, Cornwallis surrenders. The Treaty of Paris, formally ending the war, is signed in September 1783. Britain recognizes American independence and cedes the territory east of the Mississippi River. The gamble that 56 men took when they signed that document in 1776 has paid off. Barely, painfully, but it paid off. Here's something worth thinking about. The Declaration of Independence isn't really a legal document. It doesn't establish a government. It doesn't lay out laws. The Constitution does that. And the Constitution doesn't come until 1787, more than a decade later. What the Declaration does is make an argument. A moral and philosophical argument about the legitimate basis for government. And that argument, once made, can never be fully contained. Abraham Lincoln understood this better than almost anyone. Facing a nation tearing itself apart over slavery in the 1850s and 1860s, Lincoln keeps returning to the Declaration. Not the Constitution, the Declaration. Because the Constitution, as originally written, accommodated slavery. The Declaration, with its "all men are created equal," at least held out the promise of something better. Lincoln argues in his Gettysburg Address that the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He's reaching back to 1776, not 1787. He's saying the Declaration is the soul of the country, and the country has to live up to it. This is what Jefferson created, whether he fully intended to or not. A set of ideals so powerful, so universally appealing, so beautifully expressed, that they became a permanent standard by which American society could be judged, and found wanting. Repeatedly, the Declaration is invoked by abolitionists, by suffragists, by civil rights activists, by labor organizers, by immigrants, by gay rights advocates. Every marginalized group in American history that has demanded inclusion has reached for the language of the Declaration, because that language, taken seriously, demands their inclusion. All men are created equal. Not all white men, not all property-owning men. All men, and by the most natural extension, all people. Jefferson may not have meant it that way, but the words are the words, and they've proven impossible to contain. Let's come back to the 56 signers for a moment and see where they ended up. because some of their stories are fascinating. Benjamin Franklin goes on to negotiate the crucial alliance with France that helps win the war. He comes home in 1785 as the most celebrated American alive. He dies in 1790 at 84 after a life so full of achievement that it's almost incomprehensible. His funeral draws 20,000 people, enormous by the standards of the time. John Adams becomes the first vice president and second president of the United States. His presidency is largely unhappy. He's sandwiched between the towering figures of Washington and Jefferson. He makes political enemies constantly. He loses his re-election bid to Jefferson. But historians have gradually rehabilitated his reputation. He's seen today as one of the more underrated founders. Thomas Jefferson goes on to be the first Secretary of State, the second Vice President, and the third President. His presidency includes the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the United States. He and Adams have a famously complicated relationship, rivals, enemies, then friends who exchange hundreds of letters in their old age. They die on the same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Adams' last words, according to tradition, are "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died a few hours earlier, also on July 4th. The coincidence seems almost too perfect to be true, but it is. Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician who signed the Declaration, is also the person who reconnects Adams and Jefferson after years of estrangement. He has a dream in which the two old men are reconciled, and he writes to Adams about it. It works. Their late-life correspondence is one of the great literary and intellectual exchanges in American history. Some signers are largely forgotten today: William Ellery of Rhode Island, George Taylor of Pennsylvania, Button Gwinnett of Georgia, the only one of the three Georgia delegates who actually dies in the war, killed in a duel. Their names are on the document, but history has not preserved their stories the way it has preserved Franklin's and Jefferson's and Adams's. That's how history works. It keeps the brightest stars and lets the others fade. The original engrossed parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence, the one that was signed on August 2nd, 1776, is on display in the National Archives in Washington. D.C., you can go see it. It sits in a bulletproof, climate-controlled case. During the day, it's illuminated just enough for visitors to read it. At night, it's lowered into a vault. The document has had a hard life. For much of the 19th century, it was rolled up and moved around constantly. To the War Office, to Williamsburg, to Leesburg during the War of 1812, back to Washington. It was exposed to light and humidity and physical handling that degraded the parchment significantly. By the late 1800s, the ink was already fading badly. The Declaration was transferred to the National Archives in 1952. Conservation efforts have slowed, but not stopped, the fading. If you look at photographs from the 1820s compared to today, you can see how much has been lost. The signatures, which were once clear and crisp, are now difficult to read. John Hancock's famous signature has faded to almost nothing. There are other copies that are in better condition. One of the Dunlap broadsides, the printed copies made by John Dunlap on the night of July 4th to 5th, 1776, sold at auction in 2000 for $8.14 million. About 25 of these original printed copies are known to still exist. There's also the Lost Declaration, a copy that was given to King George III himself, which ended up in the British Library, where it still sits. George never read it. His government dismissed it as the work of traitors. But there it is, preserved in Britain, the document that formally ended British rule in America. We're approaching 250 years since that summer in Philadelphia. The United States of America is one of the oldest constitutional democracies in the world. The document that started it all is still cited, still debated, still argued over. Is the Declaration fulfilled? Has America lived up to its promises? Honestly, It depends on who you ask and what you measure. On one hand, the United States has over time extended rights and inclusion far beyond what the founders envisioned. Enslaved people were freed. Women got the vote. Legal segregation was dismantled. The arc, as a certain tradition of American thought holds, bends toward justice. On the other hand, the original exclusions were catastrophic in their consequences, and their legacies haven't disappeared. The wealth gaps, the incarceration rates, the health disparities, the ongoing debates about voting rights and representation, these aren't unrelated to the compromises and exclusions of 1776. The Declaration doesn't resolve these debates. It opens them. It gives everyone who believes in its promises the language to demand that those promises be kept. And it gives everyone who benefits from their violation the incentive to define the promises narrowly. That argument over who all men really means, over what equal really requires, over what the Declaration actually promised and who it promised it to, that argument is the central argument of American history. It hasn't ended. It probably won't end anytime soon. But it started in a hot room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, with a young Virginia planter sitting at a portable writing desk, searching for the right words. And he found them imperfectly, contradictorily, magnificently. He found them. Let me bring us back to where we started. You're in that room. It's August 2nd, 1776. The parchment is on the table. The quill is in your hand. You know that what you're signing is treason against the British Crown. You know that if this doesn't work, if the Continental Army loses, if Britain reasserts control, you will hang. The Declaration is extremely clear about this. You are pledging your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor. You also know that what you're signing is imperfect, that the document has been revised and compromised, that it doesn't say everything it should say, that the gap between its ideals and the reality of the society it represents is enormous. But you sign it anyway. Because the argument it makes is true, because the moment is real, because something in you believes, has to believe, that it's better to make this argument, to put these words into the world, than not to. And then you hand the quill to the man next to you. 56 signatures, one document, one gamble on the idea that people could govern themselves, that liberty was worth fighting for, that the words, "all men are created equal," were worth writing down, even if living up to them would take generations and cost incalculable suffering, and was still, in some ways, unfinished. That's what happened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. That's what you would have been part of if you were there. So there it is, the Declaration of Independence. Not as a piece of framed parchment in a museum, but as a living, contested, sometimes glorious, sometimes hypocritical, always important document. A few things I hope you take away from this. The founding wasn't clean or unanimous or inevitable. It was messy and contested. It almost didn't happen. The people who made it happen were complicated, gifted and flawed, and operating under enormous pressure. The Declaration's promises were limited at birth but expansive in principle. The gap between the two has driven American history ever since. The arguments started in 1776 are still going, and that's not a sign of failure. That's what the document was designed to produce. An ongoing argument about what equality and liberty actually require. And finally, the next time you see that document, or a reproduction of it, or hear those famous words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I hope you hear them a little differently. Not as settled history, as an open question, one that people in every generation have had to answer for themselves. If you made it this far, genuinely thank you. This was a longer one, but I think the story deserves the time. If you found this interesting, there's a lot more to dig into. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 is its own wild story. The Declaration established the ideals, But the Constitution was the brutal negotiation over how to actually put them into practice. I'll link to some of my earlier videos on that if you want to keep going. Drop in the comments. What's the part of the Declaration's story you find most interesting or most troubling? The Jefferson contradiction, the cut slavery passage, Caesar Rodney's midnight ride. I read everything down there, and I'm genuinely curious what lands differently for different people. Hit subscribe if you want more history told this way. The real version, with the complications left in. New video every week. See you in the next one.